next panel. I need to ask Ms. Wendy Weng, Director of Research of China-United States Exchange Foundation of Hong Kong, to take the moderation of this panel. Ms. Weng, please, the floor is yours. You can already go forward with your panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sebastian, for inviting and your team, including Annie, putting all this together wonderfully. And now we come to the last session of this event. In the previous sharing, it was so informative, was so diverse. Oh, can you see me? Hey.
Not yet, please.
Not yet?
Yes,
Okay.
if it is possible.
Okay.
We miss you, so please. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So can you hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, the previous sharing was informative and providing diverse perspectives, and I believe the audience like me have benefited tremendously from the speakers. So thank you very much, Michael. So coming close to the end of the two-day conference, we are now going to talk about China's relations with European states and the US, and look at how these relations affect Eurasia countries. Many speakers in the previous panels mentioned the trend of polarization, talking about policy takers becoming policy shakers and shapers. And I was impressed by Professor Gardner's call for states to stay neutral, given that it best serves most countries' interests and is the optimal way to keep the world in peace. And I think this is what China has always been advocating. However, as we can see from today's geopolitical situation, it is easier said than done, especially when we are in such a closely interacted world, and especially for small and medium powers. And this is probably why Mr. Dyke and Mr. Wensink foresaw a regionalized future. So in this panel, we have 8 speakers in total, and we will start with 3 scholars who look into China-US and China-EU power play in Eurasia. And we know that while the US and China are undoubtedly competing in the region, the relations between the EU and China are more ambivalent. And we will start from Dr. Gina Panagopoulou from the University of Piraeus in Greece, who is attending online, and Dr. Panagopoulou is going to talk about the US-China competition in Eurasia from a realistic perspective, taking Greece as an example. Then we will move to Mrs. Lolita Krasikova from Russia's High School of Economics on-site in Yerevan. Lolita is originated from Transnistria, but has been living in Russia for some years. Then we will have Mr. Sebastian Contin Trillo-Figueroa to speak. Sebastian is a lawyer turned a scholar and used to be a politician in Spain for more than 10 years. He is also the 2022 AsiaGlobal Fellow at the University of Hong Kong. And Sebastian is joining the panel via Zoom from the Philippines. And Lolita and Sebastian are going to talk about China-EU relations, and they both raise the question about whether the two big powers are partners or otherwise. Like panels before, each speakers will have 10 minutes. Dr. Panagopoulou, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from sunny Athens in Greece. I would like to thank the organizers, first of all, for giving me the chance and the honor to participate in this great conference. And I would also like to thank especially Mr. Sahayan for being so helpful every time with the organization and the details. So I will start with sharing my screen. Can you see? Does it work?
Yes, it is working.
Okay, great, thank you. So the topic I chose to provide a few thoughts on is the US-China competition in Eurasia. And I chose my country of origin to provide as a case. So this is a plan of how the presentation is going to go. First, we will talk about Eurasia's critical role, and then I will provide some significant information about the position of Greece geographically wise. Then I will provide insight on the US and Greece relationships, mainly defense and economic sector. Then I will do the same for China and Greece, and we will conclude. So Eurasia has been critical to the balance of power in the international system for many, many years. And some very striking examples are World War I and II, as well as the ongoing situation in Ukraine, which show to us that all great powers come to this geographical place when they want to acquire power or balance out some other power. So this is what the US and China have been doing. They have been competing over this region with regards to who will exercise greater influence. And this is, of course, according to their national interests, which is to maximize their benefits in the region while minimizing the costs. And in that way, they will maximize their power as well. For that purpose, they have been employing several means, but I chose to focus on financial means as well as the defense sector. So this is a global map, and Greece is the red country that you can see in the middle of the screen, more or less. As we can see, the position of the Greek state is significant because it connects Europe, Asia, and Africa, so 3 continents. And it also provides a critical point in between the Mediterranean Sea, the Suez Canal, and the Black Sea. So its geographical position make it a very strategic player in the region, and the state that many global actors, just like China and the US, would like to cooperate with in order to secure their interests in the area. Now, the US and Greece, they have been NATO allies since the early 50s, and of course they have been doing joint military exercises. Of course, these things strengthen the relationships between the states and provide a guarantee and a mutuality in their relationships. Also, the US has got a military base in Souda. It's in the island of Crete. It's in southern Greece. And this provides a strong point for the US Navy and its presence in the Mediterranean. In the recent years, the Americans have expressed an interest for acquiring the Alexandroupolis port. Alexandroupolis is in northern Greece and is pretty close to the Black Sea and the straits leading to the Black Sea. So we can understand why the US has expressed the interest for this point. Of course, it would give the American state a better starting point to go to the Black Sea and, of course, to the Aegean. These moves, these stages of the relationship between the two states, the US and the Greek state, have had benefits for both of them. They have reinforced Greece's role as a connecting point between continents and seas. And of course, it has reinforced the US presence in the area, in the Mediterranean area, as well as the Black Sea area. Now, with regards to China and Greece, China has acquired the Piraeus port through the state-owned COSCO company since 2016. And this has provided it with a very large Mediterranean port, which is a strong base for trade and for accessing the EU's single market, and also Western Europe, and of course, Africa. Now, with that move, Greece became a significant point for the new Silk Roads. And then this was further reinforced when in 2018, there was an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, signed between the two states. Their foreign ministers signed it, of course. And this MOU was within the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative framework. So with that move, Greece has strengthened its position in the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, there is, of course, a benefit for China as well, which has strengthened its own presence in the area. And this balances out the US presence, to my perspective, at least. So to conclude, the US and China try to balance each other in the Eurasian region. And we saw that it's the same thing in Greece, of course. It's a striking example. Why do they do this? Because they want to control resources, of course, and routes as well. So routes are significant for trade, for military, and Greece's geographical point provides this control over, provides this access to 3 different continents and 3 different seas. This leads to maximization of the power and the benefits of the US and China, respectively. And of course, it's an argument that reinforces the critical role Eurasia has been playing over the years, as we said at the beginning. Now, of course, the key role of Greece in the region is further highlighted, because both the 2 global players, both the US and China, want to cooperate with it and take advantage of its position. And in that way, they try to observe their national interests, which of course is the survival in the international system and maximizing their power, as I said in the beginning. So these were my thoughts on the topic. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I head back to you.
Thank you, Gina. Now we have Lolita. Lolita, please come to the stage.
Thank you. I'm here. Can you give me 4? Okay. Okay, now it's working. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you, Ms. Wang, for the introduction. The topic of my presentation is EU in China, partners or adversaries. My presentation will consist of 2 parts. The first one is political degradation against the backdrop of continuing economic interdependence. And the second one is development of a dialogue and various aspects of the future configuration of the world political system in the presence of existing contradictions. As Beijing grew in importance in global value chains, the interdependence of the European and Chinese economies intensified. In 2020, China became the EU's main trading partner, for the first time surpassing the United States. The economic component of cooperation remains its main driver, although it's experiencing structural difficulties. For example, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement could cement the increased economic interdependence between the EU and China, but amid accusations of human rights violation by the PRC, its ratification by the European Parliament and subsequent approval by the EU Council were frozen, which well illustrates the key trends in its relationship. Just a second. A year out of politicization in 2021 was caused a number of factors, the election of Joe Biden to the US presidency, and consequently, Washington's attempts to strengthen transatlantic relations, the desire of the new German government, in particular the Greens, to depart from Angela Merkel's pragmatic approach to China, and the unwillingness of the French government to squander political capital on the issue of the Comprehensive Investment Agreements and in the run-up to the 2022 elections. Moreover, the course toward China in general and towards the Comprehensive Investment Agreement in particular has become hostage to the existing dividing lines in the EU between Old and Europe and Atlanticists and the Europeanists. However, even before the spring politicization of 2021-2022, political relations between the EU and the PRC were characterized by growing contradictions. This includes China's accusation of the origin of the coronavirus and the EU's demand for an independent investigation rejected by Beijing, the PRC's criticism of alleged human rights violations, and the deteriorating political situation in Hong Kong. Beijing increased military presence in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. This trend, just a second. Sorry for technical issues. Okay. This trend was further developed during the Ukrainian crisis of 2022. Thus, 2022 EU Summit-China Summit demonstrated the attempts of European leaders to pressure Beijing to force Russia to abandon military action and restore the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The 2021-2022 degradation in political relations is reflected in the rhetorical translation of the European Union's normativity towards China. For example, EU High Representative Josep Borrell has repeatedly highlighted negative manifestations of Chinese policy, which includes the suppression of democratic freedoms and pluralism of opinion, which, in his view, affects European business in China and hampers dialogue between the parties. Also, in its reports, the EU has repeatedly stated its readiness to take action in case of continuing human rights violation in the PRC. Thus, the prevailing negative tone of the dialogue between the EU and China is combined with stable economic incentive for cooperation on the part of both actors. On the issue of the future configuration of the world order and global security, the position of the EU and China are closer than it may seem. Both sides are in favor of multipolarity, but disagree on how to maintain peace and stability in it. For example, for the European Union, the main tool is to strengthen the transatlantic cooperation, a partnership and solidarity, the cooperation of the collective West and the protection of the rules-based order. For China, it's to develop relation with non-Western participants in international relations, primarily Russia, Iran, ASEAN countries, something like that, as well as to build cooperation within multilateral associations like ASEAN, BRICS, and SCO. The purposefulness of the actors in this area is explicitly reflected in official rhetoric. For example, China emphasizes multilateral formats, mutually beneficial cooperation, and mutual respect, recognizing that contradictions between states are inevitable and will continue to rise. China opposes military solutions to conflicts and says that military intervention leads to disastrous consequences. In China's opinion, all disputes and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue, cooperation, search for common ground, and common interests. The core of the modern world political system, according to the Chinese leadership, is the United Nations, which should serve as the guarantor of peace and dialogue between states, where international law, multilateralism, and a common desire to achieve peace and maintain security play a central role. Finally, the PRC advocates a multipolar world in which the developed countries will provide all kinds of assistance to the developing ones, thus increasing the representation and voice of the latter. The European Union sees security in the territorial integrity of states, the inviolability of borders, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Like Beijing, Brussels believes that interaction between states should be in accordance with the principle of the rule of international law. Diplomatic and economic sanctions are among the EU's well-known security instruments, but China is also beginning to adopt these practices. Both actors position themselves as responsible global players. But there are differences in threat perceptions and approaches to neutralizing them. For example, the mainstream of the risk of uncontrolled international migration in the case of EU faces the misunderstanding of China, for which migration, primarily internal and related issues, are not the object of securitization, and the reason for active action on the world stage. On cybersecurity, the European Union welcomes soft approaches, that is, building stress resilience to ensure rapid recovery from cyber attacks and building the necessary capacity to counter them, while China takes a hard approach involving deterrence and dealings with threats to ensure national security. Even with similar perception of the high level of threats in areas such as international terrorism and regional military conflicts, parties may differ in their assessment of their causes and tools for countering them. Taking all the above into consideration, the EU-China dialogue on global issues is characterized by limited success at the present stage. The world order and, to a lesser extent, security and other dimensions are areas in which there are similar positions, since the parties advocate multipolarity, the rule of international law, and the resolution of issues through dialogue and partnership. However, lengthy statements on multilateral cooperation cannot be considered a sufficient common denominator to consolidate positions. The parties demonstrate different approaches to the transformation of the world political system and have different perceptions of the challenges, which is becoming more and more evident in the ongoing politicization of relations. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask me during Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So before we move to Sebastian, now we have a housekeeping issue that Orazio, are you on the panel? Yeah, okay, I can see Orazio. Okay. Now, okay, we can move on to Sebastian Contin, please.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Good to see you. Can you see my presentation or not? Not yet, right?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Oh.
You're sharing your screen.
Oh, great. Perfect. So, yeah. Okay, good afternoon from the Philippines. Wanted to thank Dr. Sahakian for the brilliant organization. He's been able to achieve these 2 brilliant days conference in Yerevan, working from Hong Kong. So congratulations also to his team. And yeah, so today I'd like to be a little bit more provocative, right? Trying to answer this question. Are China and the European Union more partners than rivals? I have to say from the very beginning that I'm a big supporter of the European Union, because I try to look to the big picture, and I think that is a remarkable achievement, a prodigy. So there is, am I doing well? Sorry. Is it going well?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. Now I see here. Yep. Okay. So yeah, I mean that there is now in Europe solidarity and trade, where before there was only competition, we have diversity. Before we only had poisonous nationalism. There is peace. Before there was always war. War after war. There was even one war called the 100 Years' War. Okay, and Europe, you know, provoked the last 2 world wars. So this is how I believe we should look to the European Union, from the dark continent to a paradise of rights and welfare states. However, today Europe does not perform as a global power. Yet I will propose some possible ways today. But first, we have to survive. The European Union is in the most difficult situation right now. It is in the middle of 2 wars, the so-called New Cold War between China and the US. And it is the epicenter of a hot war, the brutal Russian war in Ukraine. Both conflicts are weakening Europe. The hot war in Ukraine is probably the geopolitical wake-up call for the European Union. It is the most substantial change for Europe since 1989. It's also a test for China. I disagree with some people talking today about, some scholars saying that China has to be neutral. I actually think that it should be the opposite. China is expected to assume higher responsibilities as a global power. So Europe is now in this combination with several other crises: the high inflation, the energy prices, the euro dropping value, and of course the migrant crisis. People are not talking about the fact that Europe was solving a migrant crisis with 8 million human beings sheltered by Europe. So I think that we can all of us get the dimension of this achievement, right? However, I insist this hot war could actually finish very quick with the involvement of Beijing. China is the only one with the capacity to convince Putin to reverse course. And I quote Mr. Xi when said, China now stands at the center of the world stage and cannot ignore its obligations by concentrating solely on her own fates. So it is an opportunity for China to lead as a moral global power. In the Cold War between China and the US, I believe that it's Europe actually who is the only one who could intermediate and help. You know that the US is a historical European ally with many dependencies, and China is actually a European partner, a systemic rival in a multipolar world order. So Europe maintains different kind of relationships with the US or China. And I think, in my opinion, this is an asset because it could contribute to universal stability as a balancer between them. So I think that Europe needs to have a more assertive position. So far, it has been neutral actually on the trade war. It has agreed with the US to impose sanctions to Russia because of the war in Ukraine. Yet it has never agreed with the US to impose import tariffs on China. And I think this is very relevant because the US, of course, could persuade Europe to sanction China, Beijing would probably retaliate. And that's why I believe that Europe should assume a more confident role. How? 3 years ago, Europe defined China as a negotiating partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival. So negotiating partner because China's economic relevance in Europe is more significant for many member states than the dependence on the US. Regarding trade, China and the European Union are more complementary than substitution. But it's an economic competitor because competition is growing with a huge European external deficit against China. Systemic rival because China is considered a tough geopolitical adversary, but this complex definition unveils how the European Union would like a deeper relationship with further global roles. But would China help Europe to fulfill that challenge? The fact is that Europe reacts slowly to global changes. You know that Europe is a historical construction. It has an institutional architecture, and being 27 member states makes every process complex. And you can say that the EU's configuration is a never-ending construction in permanent need of improvements. This is why domestic strength is crucial, and troubles for getting internal cohesion is a big disadvantage. So this is not new. The European Union was represented already in 1991 as an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military worm, because probably it could not be something better. For avoiding war, the European Union started as a soft power and was built on principles and values. So how is the situation now between Europe in the middle of the US-China rivalry? Okay, the European Union characteristics do not really allow to improve any policy overnight. So how to compete with the Chinese pragmatism, strong centralization, or the US assertiveness and leadership? So China has practiced in Europe the divide et impera doctrine, okay? Divide and rule, divide and conquer, but Europe has also faced the abandon of the US since 2011 when Obama shifted the strategy with the pivot to Asia. And then Trump said in 2018 that the European Union was set up to take advantage of the US, and we can't let that happen. He also said the European Union is possibly as bad as China, just smaller. It is terrible what they do to us. So Europe was having higher expectations about potential Biden's changes, which have not happened yet. And we have an explanation probably in Brzezinski's definition, when in 1997 he said that at some point a truly united and powerful Europe could become a global political rival to the US. It could become a difficult economic technological competitor, while its geopolitical interests could significantly diverge from those of America. And before, we have heard Lolita talking about the comprehensive agreement on investments signed between China and the EU in 2020, and China understood that the US decoupling from Europe was an opportunity. So was trying to change its bypassing strategy, but also Europe was mistrusting China in the continent because I was asking for a level playing field. Europe is not open today to the Chinese trade and investments, but China is open, and Europe is open for China, but China is not open for China, and China is not open for European companies. So European companies compete asymmetrically with Chinese state-owned enterprises, publicly financed, and can invest in European strategic sectors, while the European Union forbids state aid. So there is need for reciprocity. But 2 years after, CAI is still an agreement in principle waiting for ratification, and its destiny remains unclear. So, strategic sovereignty. The European Union started a self-reflection before the war in Ukraine in order to solidify as an influential global geopolitical power, and this is the formula: a new foreign policy opportunity to achieve long-term objectives, a more geopolitical significant Europe. And how to achieve it? The best way would be a higher degree of federalism. The states should delegate more competences to the European Union, but no one wants to do it. So a post-national Europe still scares many, but no one is presenting real alternatives. So we also had the collective defense. The strategic sovereignty has been lastly related to security, Paradoxically, the US was pushing for a more autonomous European Union, but at the same time does not approve any step forward. Kaplan wrote in 2012 that the more united Europe becomes, the greater the tensions with the US, and this is a fact. The present endeavors are not sufficient. Every state has its own army, dividing efforts, mounting inefficiencies, spoiling resources, when the 27 military budgets altogether would be the third ranked worldwide. Another step forward is the European Union strategy for the Indo-Pacific, signed in September 2021. It's good geoeconomics, but hard on trade, shy in politics. So the European Union wants to have a say at the new world's center of gravity, where the maritime world, where worldwide trade at the heart of the global production and the core of the geopolitical decisions, and turning to. So how can the European Union become sharper and more proactive? Europe has to solidify as an autonomous and influential global geopolitical power. First, improving a deeper integration. Second, with more reciprocity, has to raise as a peer with both China and the US. And third, with multilateral leadership. Trade has to be linked to geopolitics, foreign policy, and security. And three projects can help to convert the main priorities in achievements: the comprehensive agreement on investment entry into force, the execution of the European Union strategy in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, once it's updated, and the necessary steps for having a collective defense structure with operational objectives. So thank you very much for your attention. This is all.
You're muted, Wendy.
Muchas gracias, Sebastian. Thank you very much, Gina and Lolita and Sebastian. And we can see, although the EU is historically leaning much toward the US, the recurrent disparity within the EU indeed created some room for the bloc to move between the US and China. And as Sebastian just mentioned about the Cold War and Hot War, that EU and China can both play very active roles to mitigate those conflicts. And yeah, I totally agree that, and also as Lolita and Sebastian suggested, a united and independent EU is probably what Europeans would like to see. So the following four speakers are going to introduce their thoughts about China's relations with specific European states or sub-regions in Europe. Firstly, we will have Mr. Maximilian Ohle from Germany, and he is a Ph.D. candidate in political science at the University of Tübingen. Max prepares his paper together with Dr. Richard J. Cook and Professor Han Zhaoying from Nankai University in China. And their paper is about China-German economic and political relations. And then we will have Mr. Orazio Gnerre from the University of Perugia to talk about China-Italian relations. His paper is more economic focused. Then we will go to Mr. Radu Sava in Yerevan. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Bucharest. I saw you, Sava, yesterday asking questions. And Radu used to study at Tsinghua University in Beijing and stayed in China for 2.5 years. And in his research, Radu wants to test his hypothesis about the two countries' political relations in the COVID era. And after that, Mr. Dimitri Yeroyan from Austria's International Institute for applied systems analysis will share with us some findings about China's relations with Central and Eastern European countries. He will focus on foreign direct investment against the backdrop of pandemic. So Max and Radu are in Yerevan, and Orazio and Dimitri will present online. Again, please keep the presentation in 10 minutes. Over to you in Yerevan next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. First of all, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude for all organizers, specifically Dr. Sahakian, for all the wonderful hospitality that we received. Also on behalf of my colleagues who unfortunately could not attend the conference, but I'm pretty certain that they would be very happy, and I will spread the words about the Armenian hospitality. Actually, the presentation that I'm going to give is a direct continuation of the presentations that my colleagues already held. It specifically focuses on Germany's hedging stratagem, with the focus being on the question of how is Germany able to reconsolidate its transatlantic ties with the US while simultaneously maintaining beneficial economic relations with China, and why they behave in that way. Because at first sight, it seems to be a fundamental contradiction. The value-based, rules-based international order to which Germany is committed as one of the largest stakeholders, while simultaneously increasing its economic engagement with China, seeking to deepen cooperation, specifically promoted by companies. And in that context, we recognize that Germany has adopted a hedging posture, seeking to benefit from both projects. In that sense, security provision and the continuation of ideological narratives, democratization, the spread of values and norms across the globe, while the economic benefits are such a tempting component despite China's grave human rights record, among other policy issues. And hedging is here defined, following Evelyn Goh's definition, as a set of strategies aimed at avoiding a situation in which states cannot decide upon more straightforward alternatives such as bandwagoning, balancing, or neutrality. And commonly, hedges attempt to offset the risks by gaining a range of benefits. And in that context, it refers to an omnidirectional or a multi-vector engagement. This is commonly seen in Asia-Pacific, where hedging has been mostly applied. Some contributions also covered Central Asia. A European trajectory is still in the process of evolution, and this is what this project seeks to contribute as a as a contribution to expand the political discourse on hedging with regard to a case study in Europe, to amplify certain characteristics that diverge from those that we see in Asia Pacific and in Central Asia. We recognize in the international system there are level stresses deriving from the Sino-US competition that essentially determine the output of international politics. And while these great powers are competing, second-tier states, among which we classify Germany, are engaged in unit-level based hedging. And that essentially determines their foreign policy. However, while system-based stresses could gradually force secondary powers to choose sides, we see that in certain situations, the space to hedge begins to shrink. And in that context, states are forced to choose sides because they can no longer benefit from both projects, specifically under the condition of a gradual polarization in the international system. What does that essentially mean for Germany's foreign policy? Germany's hedging strategy has led to different policy outcomes, and it is reflective of finding a balance between alliance commitments to the US and the value-based international order, while simultaneously seeking closer economic engagement, as I said before. And for decades, the economic paradigm, or the paradigm that forged German foreign economic policy, was a change through trade paradigm, or Wandel durch Handel. And initially, it was designed to induce political transformations in target states. During the Cold War, it was most notably the former GDR, but also post-Soviet Russia, among others. And after China's reform and opening up, Germany sought to induce political transformation in China as well. More trade in exchange for certain institutional changes that respect human rights, democracy, inalienable rights such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of media, etc. And in that context, Germany increased its trade volume with China with mediocre results. And for decades, there are two cleavages, with the latter being of late mostly recognized. The politics-economics cleavage, in which companies are seeking closer engagement with China, while the politicians are a bit more hesitant, specifically the Green Party and the Liberal Democratic Party, who strongly advocate human rights standards. And there are intergovernmental cleavages. The SPD, for example, is a very strong opponent for closer economic engagement with China, while, as said, the Green Party and the Liberals, as the latest coalition partners, advocate the abidance by human rights standards as a condition to induce closer economic engagement. And these cleavages have been persisting for several months and even years, if we also consider the previous Merkel administrations. Germany's change through trade narrative, however, has been consistently undermined by companies. Prime emphasis on increasing trade were given by these companies, such as Volkswagen, which operates a firm in Xinjiang, which is known for grave human rights violations. And lobbyists are able to canalize their influence into German foreign policy and economic policy making. And that means that the German government is essentially outsourcing some of its foreign policy resources to the private sector. Another example would involve KUKA, Germany's primary robotics manufacturer, which was bought by Midea for $5 million. And China also bought Eichstron, a German ship producer, which also engages in the development of military technology. And specifically, the US was principally concerned about it. Major German companies such as Allianz, BASF, Siemens, and BMW also received favorable investments conditions in China. And simultaneously, the German government has embarked on the political discourse that the EU has been promoting, labeling China as a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So how does that correspond to a coherent foreign policy? So essentially, the German government has failed to elaborate a clearly formulated foreign policy as to how to engage with China and how to induce a political transformation induced by the change through trade policy. And what's more, China, in fact, has now adapted to that, having adopted a change through trade practice with Chinese characteristics to influence German economic foreign policy making, and they are exploiting these cleavages and to gain power capabilities. Most notably, the latest instance involving Costco and the port of Hamburg. Costco now controls 24.9% as allowed by the federal government, but has no veto rights. And that was enabled by Chancellor Olaf Scholz of the SPD. Despite the fact that most of the German public and his two coalition partners were strictly against that policy. And to conclude, these discrepancies between business and politics, and also within the coalition government, resulted in policy incoherence and a lack of a clear strategy. And that is why this hedging posture will continue as long as the space to hedge has not yet shrunken. And despite the fact that the great power competition is intensifying, the German government has not yet become prepared for the intensification. And that is why it has recognized the certain economic benefits from which the companies want to benefit, specifically in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And Germany has also been unwilling to take a leading role to utilize its power capabilities to enforce a clearly formulated strategy that could lead to a broader discourse, not only within Germany, but also within the European Union in terms of policy coherence vis-a-vis China. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions.
Okay, thank you. So now we are going to hand the floor to Orazio, Gnerre in Italy. So Orazio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will read my speech. First of all, good day to all present. I take this opportunity to thank those who are here live or connected as me, and who will listen patiently to my speech, as well as the organizers of this important international conference. First of all, Dr. Sakian. I am always very happy to take part in it, in this series of conferences, and I believe that the level of the speeches is very high, really. I'll also try to be very brief for the 10 minutes I have, as I've only, yes, just for this. I hope to be able to keep me in the allotted time. It will not be easy, since talking about the commercial exchange between Italy and China within such a varied, multifaceted, and constantly evolving context as that of the market in the second decade of the 21st century would require an in-depth examination with a dissection of the data and the analysis of various trends. Obviously, this is not possible for us here, so we will keep in mind only a few elements that are relevant to us. Elements that simultaneously touch the sphere of commerce and that of politics, inserted in a geographical perspective. To approach the geographical question, we must immediately note how the People's Republic of China and the Italian Republic are two states that cover relatively distant areas of the great Eurasian continent. Prominent members of the Asian culture and of the European one, their stories have frequently intertwined over the centuries, due to a particular predisposition of both peoples for the art of diplomacy. Not only diplomacy, however, but also trade. One of the most used figures within the business diplomacy of contemporary China is that of the Silk Road, notoriously. The Silk Road, which included the land and sea routes, connected the Roman Empire to the Chinese one. It was reticular and connected, in addition to these two large political entities, many other peoples who took advantage of the commercial exchanges that this great infrastructure of antiquity. The cultural weight that the famous work of the Italian character Marco Polo Il Milione, that was the name of his work, has had over the centuries in China is also very much felt. It was precisely about the travel of the commercial roads between East and West, between Italy and China. Marco Polo and his uncle Matteo were in fact two merchants of the Republic of Venice, one of the strongest and most commercially active political entities during that historical period, the Middle Ages, in Italy. Both of them arrived in China at the court of the Khan and remained there for 17 years, even being awarded government offices and bringing back to the Italians the memory of what they had seen there in China. This tradition, moreover, will be reconfirmed in the centuries to come by various cultural exchanges due to important personalities still remembered in China today, such as the Catholic priest Matteo Ricci. All this is not secondary, as it testifies to two things indeed. On the one hand, the very long tradition of commercial exchanges between the Italian peninsula and China, and on the other hand, the interrelationship between the commercial dimension and the more properly cultural one that these exchanges generated. Diplomacy is a level in which these two dimensions touch and merge, politics and economics indeed. The Silk Road, famously, is an image widely recovered by the current government of the People's Republic of China and its political leadership for new projects of construction of an infrastructural and commercial framework on the Eurasian continent and beyond. This image is not only symbolic, but rather testifies the feasibility of the project, which already existed in other forms centuries and centuries before. Obviously, in the 21st century, the question takes on new forms and capabilities, technical in nature, of communication speed from one place to another and other issues. New needs and new markets are added to it, as well as the possibility of expanding the spaces affected by this planning. There is also the absolute novelty of air travel that adds to it, also contemplated in this project, the new Silk Road. Nonetheless, something of the ancient Silk Road is also in the new Silk Road. If the role of diplomatic and commercial history between Italy and China is so important, it was very difficult for it not to find outlets in the contemporary market, which is in turn conditioned by cultural issues. This is a principle which must be considered in the economic dimension and in discussions. China and Italy are two countries whose commercial interests converge for various reasons. After the end of the Cold War, China entered the WTO and entered the international market in an even more evident way than in the era inaugurated by Deng Xiaoping of that of the open door policy. The end of the Cold War also meant, in many ways, the conclusion of an international division based on political issues which saw China and Italy on different positions, despite the persistent interest of the Mediterranean country for the Asian one. That is testified, by the way, by various intellectuals and anthropologists and diplomats and so on. China has based its development on its export capacity, but in more recent times, it has reconverted its economy towards increasing its inhabitants' propensity to consume. Also thanks to an economic and social policy aimed at maximizing citizens' well-being. In this sense, the role of the so-called Made in Italy still has an important role to play on the world stage, being synonymous with quality and professionalism in manufacturing, as well as the national style the Italian national style, by the way, that distinguishes the Italian peninsula. The latest annual data of Italian exports to China give an estimate of more than 10 billion euros in value, with an increase of 2.7% compared to the directly previous quota. By dissecting the data, it is possible to realize that China's purchase largely from Italy, I mean, largely correspond to technical equipment useful for various purposes, from engines to electronics, as well as chemical products. But a not inconsiderable slice of imports from Italy is made up from leather and clothing, commercial categories in which the Made in Italy brand is notoriously renowned. Also with, for example, food, the food sector and so on, that is not very specialized in this exchange now. However, this relationship is two-way. Italy itself imports almost 4 times as much as the value of its exports from China. Italian imports from China amount to around 40 billion, always converging on the same sectors that also characterize Italian exports to the Asian country. One of the great advantages that Italy could seek in trade with China is that of the internationalization of its businesses. One of the key factors in guaranteeing greater growth for the Italian productive sectors. All of these could accelerate and increase in volume, possibly involving other sectors as well. One of the strategies to increase this type of exchange could certainly be that of cooperation in the construction of the new Silk Road. But this type of planning is having its ups and downs within the reception of the Italian governments and politics. Within the memorandum on the development of this project, the former Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte had accepted both Italy's entry into the economic project of the New Silk Road and the proposal to make Italy a maritime hub for this project. In this sense, the role of the port of Trieste, an Italian city located on the shores of the Adriatic Sea, is fundamental. When this happened in 2019, Italy was the first country in the European Union to sign a similar agreement.
Excuse me, please speed up. Thank you.
I'm just 2 minutes, okay? This obviously plays a strong symbolic role if we consider how the image of the Silk Road traces its ancestry in the relationship between the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire. This type of memorandum, however, envisaged a package of agreements between the institutions and public bodies on the one hand, and between companies on the other. Among other things, China has reconfirmed its investments in the so-called Motor Valley of the Italian region Emilia-Romagna, where it intends to build an electric car manufacturing site. The memorandum, among other things, also provides for the promotion of the historical national culture of the two countries and its safeguarding through UNESCO. This underlines the importance of the cultural factor in this type of relationship, in which the commercial element is fundamental, but not the only one. To conclude, it is impossible to fully describe the structure of commercial relations between Italy and China, nor the complete history and planning of Italian-Chinese relations in the framework of the New Silk Road project. However, it is important to note how this type of relationship is part of a restructuring of world political geography, where relatively young states, such as China, are entering the international market as top-level players, also promoting themselves, as explained by Xi Jinping at the Davos Forum in 2017, as defenders of this same market order, although framed within a regulatory order that limits its negative effects. We need to keep these economic and commercial factors in mind if we want to grasp some fundamental aspects of a political and international nature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Orazio. So now we come to Radu in Yerevan. Radu, please.
Good afternoon. Hello. I was wondering if my PPT was on. I will try to be as brief as possible, although my research that I've conducted for the past 2 to 3 months has been quite extensive, and I'm looking very much forward to the upcoming edited volume at Routledge in 2023. So I will briefly discuss, I don't know, the technical again, some theoretical considerations of my research, preliminary results after putting together results of the survey that I've conducted, and then the Q&A, obviously. Beginning from the notion of bilateralism, I think it's important that we think of this as something that happens in an external environment as well as internal one. I was wondering if I can go back. I don't think I can go back to my second page, because, and getting back to the idea, externalized bilateralism in this research, it's projected on or upon the China CEE 16+1 platform. We couldn't say it's 16+1 anymore, but that's probably why this multi-bilateral dimension could bring significance, because we're externalizing a concept that it's in contradiction with, if we compare the European and the Chinese perspective. We have, and especially in the aftermath of having the Baltics withdraw from the platform, and probably the Czech Republic following soon. And then on the other hand, we have the internalized dimension of multi-bilateralism, in the sense that it identifies and tracks down a trend that could already be observed in Romanian-Chinese relations, that is the tendency to decentralize bilateral relations, to take them to a local level and have a different sort of coordination that would eventually have an effect in an up-down and down-up approach. So beyond any theoretical consideration, I applied around 30 surveys with China preoccupied scholars in Romania, as well as China preoccupied public civil servants from, we had an institutional outreach from different institutions, including the Romanian Academy, the lower chamber of the parliament, the executive, and some of the results are very interesting. Is this? Okay, now I figured it out. You just have to go with the, I think, with the finger on. Can you please help me, the technical, to go like part 2? So you would control it manually, because this is really like problematic. Okay. So I just selected a few questions that I think are important for our discussion here today. The first one was that we see that around 50% of respondents do believe that, on a scale from, we see here from 1 to 5, so 3 being perhaps the neutral one, believe that the COVID pandemic has strengthened Romanian-Chinese relations. We have seen a lot of action from the perspective of mask diplomacy, donations that have come through local cooperation from different provinces in China or different municipalities and even districts that have cooperation agreements with cities across Romania. And this might have been reflected in the answers that were recorded. Another question would be, and this is equally interesting, we have 40% on the same scale, 40% as well as another 40% of respondents thinking that the pandemic indeed has strengthened cooperation in the detriment of centralized Romanian-Chinese relations. And when I say centralized relations, I refer to those contacts that are at high level and those contacts that are coordinated by the executive in general, because that's the branch of government that has a final say in conducting bilateral relations. Another interesting question to me, and here we see there's also like pretty much no consensus within those questioned, whether or not the pandemic, oh no, that was, has strengthened centralized cooperation. That was, I think, okay, never mind. I'm a bit nervous, which doesn't really happen, but another inquiry which has been brought up was whether our respondents thought about the conduct, which I was talking about earlier. And this is very interesting because 70% of respondents still think that the centralized dimension is the stakeholder in how we can conduct relations with China. But you know, if we're to think about the history, Romania is still having relations for over 73 years with China. Here's a contradiction to see that despite increased levels of local cooperation, there's still respondents still felt the need to observe that from the this is an assumption, obviously, from the perspective of control and administrative control, the centralized level is still the one that should coordinate Romanian-Chinese relations. And you know, from this point of view, it could be valid because once, let's say, there are local agreements to be signed, they have to go through two different ministries, and along the process, a lot of data is lost and a lot of contact between local Romanian authorities and local Chinese authorities. Another interesting point from the on the long term, whether respondents thought of potential for enhancing Romanian-Chinese relations overall, we see that again there's quite a division, but it's dominant to see that the yes, definitely margin dominates, and they believe that there is more potential for local cooperation. And then on the part of extending this issue and going back a bit to the internalized and externalized dimension, it might sound you know, complex, but from a very simplistic perspective and not simple, we have two hypotheses based on a deductive model that we have to, you know, test. The one is related to the overall state of affairs in China CEE platform, and then the other one is based on this trend. And there are two things here to bear in mind. One, Russia's war in Ukraine has affected China's image in Central and Eastern Europe. And the second one, the definition itself of what could be multilateralism from the perspective of China is very different to a European contextualized perspective. And here we have, for example, Liu Toukui, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who says that has a theory basically, who says that bilateral plus multilateral emphasizes that bilateral cooperation is the foundation and the fundament goal, while multilateral cooperation is the functional enhancement, the spillover, and the expansion of bilateral cooperation. And by bilateral cooperation, he means that between China and other countries, multilateral cooperation and bilateral cooperation on a broader platform run in parallel, which is very interesting. But that's the Chinese perspective.
Sorry, Radu, we are running out of time. So,
Yes.
okay. Thank you very much
for your attention. Thank you.
Very punctual. Thank you. So now we go to Mr. Dimitri Yerohin from Austria. Dimitri, please unmute yourself and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to present on the Chinese outward foreign direct investment to the Central and Eastern European countries in the pandemic and post-pandemic world. And given the lack of time, I will try to be short. So we know that the CE region is a strategic region for China. On the one hand, it opens a gate the rest of the European market, and first of the European Union, and on the other hand, it is not saturated yet by the Chinese investments, so that it is a very perspective market from quite different perspectives. And if we look at the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, we would see that actually FDI to the CE from China increased because the CE countries were looking for other regions which could invest into them as part of their recovery process. In general, we would expect that foreign direct investment declined following the pandemic, and we see it also in the statistics. However, on average, the Central and Eastern European region was hit less than the rest of the world. And it remains very attractive for China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative region, as part of the 16+1 framework, and all the negative effects, if there are any negative effects, are only temporary. So the research question is, how did the pandemic affect the investments of China to the Central and Eastern European countries? And to analyze that, I used 4 different data sets. So I have Chinese outward foreign direct investment, which is the MOFCOM data. I have the inward FDI by the Central and Eastern European countries, which is the IMF data. Then I have the OECD data, which distinguishes between direct investments and indirect investments. It is relevant, for example, the case of Hong Kong or British Virgin Islands or Mauritius, which could be used as potential conduit countries for Chinese investments all over the world. And I also look at the Chinese Global Investment Tracker, which tracks particular Chinese FDI projects all over the world, but first of all in the Belt and Road Initiative region. And to run the regressions, I have the ordinary least squares analysis, and I also include country and year fixed effects. So coming to the results, I find that actually there was a positive and significant effect of the pandemic on foreign direct investment from China to the Central and Eastern European countries. So it means that FDI did not decline as a response to the pandemic, as in particular in this region, and we can also see it graphically on average in all of the respective countries. Another interesting thing that we can see here is the difference between the MOFCOM data and the IMF data, and it suggests that there are still huge discrepancies in how FDI is determined in different statistics, and that future measures are necessary to align these statistics together. Then I look at the OECD data, which distinguishes between ultimate and immediate FDI, and the difference between the two is the indirect FDI, which shows how much investors invest directly from China to these countries and how much is forwarded by some conduit structures. And here we see that actually indirect foreign direct investment increased, and it could suggest that the investors look for other alternative routes to decrease their investment costs and invested indirectly from conduit countries, offshore financial centers, or tax havens. So what is the outlook? Both China and the Central and Eastern Europe are interested in a cooperation, so the region remains strategic for China as a gateway to the European Union and also as a market with a huge potential. And the Central and Eastern European countries are also interested in the Chinese investments because they need them for their post-pandemic recovery process. At the same time, given the geopolitical environment, we would expect that the competition between China and other geopolitical centers, such as the European Union, the United States, will increase, and there could be additional limits introduced in these countries, which could make it harder for Chinese investors to enter into the region. So to conclude, I would like to say that after analyzing 4 different sources of data, I find that there was no negative effect of the pandemic on Chinese outward investments to the Central and Eastern European countries. So on the contrary, there was a positive effect. Moreover, Chinese investors started investing more indirectly, so potentially to decrease their costs, such as, first of all, taxes between China and the respective countries, using alternative routes as offshore financial centers. For the future, the CE region is likely to remain a very perspective, a very attractive region for Chinese investors. And one policy recommendation would be that both China and the countries need to work further to align their statistics and to decrease the discrepancies between statistics to make it easier to understand who is really investing where, from where the investments come from, and to construct efficient investment and taxation policies. The limitation of the study is that there is not yet data available on the year 2021 or not fully available, so the analysis focuses on the year 2020 only. And when the data on 2021 and also 2022 will become available, then this data will be included into it to see how the effect evolved, not only in the short run when the pandemic started, but also in the medium run or even in the long run. And I would like with this to thank you for your attention and to welcome you to Austria. This is the Luxembourg castle where our institute is located. And I'm really sorry if there are some potential background noises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. So thank you all the 4 speakers. Mr. Morris just said earlier in the afternoon that ASEAN is phenomenally diverse. After listening to speakers in our panel, I would like to say that the EU is no less. And Orazio, I would like to say Chinese people love Italian food and artcraft, and please export more high quality Italian products to China. And Radu, your first-hand investigation is very valuable. And Dimitri, thank you for bringing us at least one piece of good news in this tumultuous world. Okay, so last but not least, let's turn our eyes back to the relations between the 2 largest economies, the US and China. And as Professor Reyes and Dr. Hakata mentioned before, the concept of Indo-Pacific that has constantly mentioned nowadays has generated by the West, generated from the West, including Japan, which is actually the creator of this concept, to counter China, to exclude China from their system. And our last speaker, Mr. Ahmad Box Jamali, a Ph.D. candidate at Shanghai International Studies University in China, is going to share with us what he and Dr. Mohammed Hossein and Professor Liu Hongsong observed about the security competition between the US and China in the Indian Ocean region. And they see the 2 countries' ties with South Asia serve as factor that has been containing their conflicts in the region. And Jamali is presenting his paper from Pakistan. Jamali, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sure. Am I audible now? All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Moderator Randy, and thank you so much, organizing committee of the Eurasian Research Council for Armenia, for organizing this wonderful two-day international conference. Thank you so much, Sir Maher Sahakian, for providing us, me and my colleagues, this wonderful opportunity to talk about this esteemed topic on US-China competition, framing new security architecture in the Indian Ocean region. So basically, by looking at this map, it seems that this region is really important for global trade, financing, and shipping lane, because Indian Ocean region is estimated to run through 75% of the global shipping trade and 50% of the oil passage from this region. And why this region is so important for great power competition, especially the United and China. There are certain reasons. This Indian Ocean region is full of choke points. If you can see from this figure, 41% of the world's maritime trade and 80% of the world oil trade and 100% of the submarine fiber optics cable running through this Middle East, Africa, and Europe, and pass through Indian Ocean choke points every second. So this region, the Indian Ocean region, has got immense significance for two great powers and how they are playing their strategic competition for framing new security architecture in this region. So to briefly outline, this is how our paper looks like. In the introduction section, I will give a brief summary, and then how the US Indo-Pacific strategy is going to play out, and the role of India, because India is key player and has a larger stakes and strategic backyard in this region, and how this play in US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Later, I will focus on China's BRI and its maritime sea component is a key open sea protection strategy that is focusing on protecting maritime overseas interest. And this is covering the first part. And in the later part, I will focus on framing new security architecture and how these great powers are framing new security architecture in the Indian Ocean region. So with this timeline in head, the second part will focus on Indo-US defense collaboration and Pakistan-China. These two, I would say, growing powers, rising powers, not that much potential in terms of economy, but India is definitely an emerging power in South Asia and Indian Ocean at large. By looking at the introduction section, the basic content I cover is about how the bilateral cooperation from the Cold War and the post-Cold War turned out in a very significant feature in US-China relations, and why there were rising antagonism and resentment between US and China relations, specifically the post-Cold War period and post-9/11 period. Things were really working on positive trajectory in US-China relations, specifically during Obama administration, though there was hedging, but at the same time, there was a cooperation as a component. But when Trump came to office, he came up with a new strategy. And his strategies were totally anti-China, in which national security strategy of 2017, national defense strategy, all these were focusing on China as a revisionist power and a strategic competitor that are seeking to play a new role in defense, strategic, and maritime technological competition. So also the trade war, which further added more fuel to fire and upended substantial rise in the bilateral cooperation, which turned into severe downturn. So by covering the relation aspect, how a scholarly approach has been taken out in framing security architecture. Different scholars have summarized the security architecture and the role of US-China in various regions, specifically the Western Pacific and Pacific Ocean, South China Sea, and the role of maritime security strategies from various perspectives, especially Goldstein, his usage of theorizing crisis stability and the phenomena of offensive defense theory dominated uphold the role of strategic deterrence in US-China defense framework from the recently published security studies issued back in 2020 by Cavalry and Dobrzhansky. And also Cunningham in the same issue talks about the naval coercion and blockade. What I cover is that because their focus was really that specific issue published by security study was focused on the Western Pacific region. What I am going, me and my colleague decided to focus on Indian Ocean region. So, and how these studies couldn't cover up the security architecture, broadly framing on the strategic hostility and the proponents of crisis escalation in navigating US-China competition, but only in Indian Ocean region, and what are the key instigating factors. So however, these study lack to underline the key factors that have predominantly maximized the US-China quest to build new security architecture, broadly framing in the Indian Ocean region. So in this context, this paper aimed to fill the gap by asking what obstructs both states to reach a feasible consensus for de-escalating the maritime rivalry threshold. So in this phenomena, the research question of our paper is how are the implications of US-China competition being played out and witnessed, and what are its key proponents in the Indian Ocean region. To summarize the big argument into small, we tried to focus on a strategic dilemma and briefly pointed out that bilateral relations face the dilemma of a strategic consensus that has predominantly increased the strategic reluctance from both sides. So as a result, we saw there is a new security architecture being filed up in the Indian Ocean region. So this paper is seeking to draw attention to that rising threshold and strategic peculiarity in US-China maritime relations. So in the introduction part, we cover these the key point that how relations was kept out from time to time, and the theoretical approach used by different scholars, earlier scholars, and their short points that they couldn't cover. So in the US free, in the second point, US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and India's role in the Quad mechanism. As we know, majority of the earlier speakers talk about Eurasia. So this is something relevant also in this phenomenon. The term Indo-Pacific as a new geopolitical construct was evident back in the speech of Hillary Clinton and later the foreign policy Obama by tracing it the route of pivot to Asia strategy back in 2011. So basically, it was a reframing of the region and strategic mobilization of resources from Middle East to Asia Pacific at that time. So when Trump came to office, he came up with a free and open, that was the same rebalancing strategy, but with some more nationalistic and mercantilist approach, and in which he came up with APEC Summit conference held in Vietnam back in 2017. So Indo-Pacific was basically what he enlarged the regional construct of the region from the Pacific Ocean to India's west coast. So in other words, his key focus was largely aimed at reframing the region, continuing the Obama's policy. So why India is important? India is key in this phenomena because of the strategic documents and India's bigger role in this region and historical role as Indian Ocean as its strategic backyard. It holds a remarkable relationship with the United States as a major defense partner, as a near security provider, and in the key ally, not a quasi-ally, not a full ally like Japan and Australia, but majority of the scholars have agreed that it's a quasi-alliance between them, or which we recently saw, which I will discuss in the later part, that how this alliance is being played out with the S-4 missiles that India got from Russia and the waiver of the CASA sanctions from the United States. So within Quad mechanisms, India also play a remarkable role, and it has brought a recently shift in its defense relations. And the recent Malabar exercises in 2020 also witnessed India's shifting dynamics in line with the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. So free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and India's role is key for United States, and it is further enhancing India's East policy. So in the China's BRI and open sea protection, we see the role of BRI as a signature initiative consisting of Maritime Silk Road, 21st century Maritime Silk Road, and Silk Road Economic Belt. So basically, what in this paper, what we are covering is the role of Maritime Silk Road and open sea protection as China's strategies that are being played out within the domain of BRI in its Chinese presence along the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea to protect vital interests. So the 10th Defense White Paper in 2050 is a key document that has given a new guideline to BRI in terms of securing sea lines of communications and mobilizing forces from offshore water defense to open sea protection. So that has given more balanced development of People's Liberation Army and Navy sea denial, sea control, and power projection capabilities. And in this military modernization phenomena and a process that this document, this defense white paper come across, by 2030, there will be a number of aircraft carriers being played out in this region, and number of new military modernization equipments will be found. So this is how
Jamali, please speed up. We are running out of time. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'm coming to the second part. So in this part, the key area where these two, US and China, big part are playing the new security, framing new security architecture is a key proponent. We see the defense relations between the rising defense collaboration between India and the United States. So under Modi government, we saw the rising strategic partnership and various strategic formulations between United States and China, and between India and America. So number of initiatives like LEMOA, Logistical Exchange Memoranda of Understanding, and COMSOCA, Communication and Compatibility and Security Agreement, were formalized that help India to achieve various defense equipments. So in 2018, also a number of exercises were conducted between United States and America and India on Army, Navy, and Air Force in this region. So as I mentioned earlier, the growing scholarships talk about the growing US-China mutual reliance is quasi-alliance. So when it comes to dealing with Pakistan, China, we saw, despite Pakistan enjoy some indicators of strong relations with China, and recently, since Pakistan has inaugurated its first national security policy, is focusing remains fundamentally on from geostrategic to geoeconomics to maximize its foreign policy goals and economic security domain. So Pakistan-China relations have always been fundamental in arms and security, and in the history of relations between the two countries, Pakistan has got enough supply of weapons, equipments, and military equipments to make asymmetrical relations with United States, with India in this region. So various reports have been conducted by SIPRI that how China is getting supplies to Pakistan in terms of military modernization. Another factor is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is key to provide another linchpin of China-Pakistan relations. A number of projects have been conducted, and over 24 billion US dollar have been invested. So if we look at here in the Quad report, this is where the majority of the trade and ship will go from this region to different part of the world under the BRI and China-Pakistan economic corridor. So this is where, and this within the Indian Ocean, the Gwadar port for China is key to access Middle East and Arabian Sea and in Indian Ocean region as a whole. So what we concluded is that to address the dilemma of strategic consensus, there's dire need, because South Asia is already a volatile region, and because of two nuclear powers are already here. So this is not Southeast Asia, this is South Asia. South Asia is highly volatile because of Pakistan and India, historical ties and wars. So anything that will provoke strategic miscalculation will definitely be not only disastrous for India and Pakistan and in Indian Ocean region, but to the extra regional players as well. So to address that dilemma of strategic consensus, these two great powers need to go for strategic coexistence and comprehensive formulations and joint task force under the framework of Indo-PACOM and PLAN to maximize their strategic communication, not only in the South China Sea, but in the Indian Ocean region as well. So thank you so much. This was all from my side.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamali. For sure, South Asia is increasingly important strategically for any major power nowadays, not only because of its location, but also because of its complex history of engagement with different parts of the world. So I think we are now running out of time. May I ask Mihail, are we allowed to ask one or two questions?
Sure, Wendy,
okay,
sure.
So okay, could you please help me to spot who have questions?
Yes, at first, Mr.
Thank you.
Morris, after Professor Gartner, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be provocative again, and I apologize in advance for this, but Henry Kissinger has talked quite a lot about the way that the United States pursues realist policy, but actually it dresses it up in all kinds of liberal ideology around bringing democracy and human rights to the world, while meanwhile it doesn't actually do that on the ground. I want to ask about the German case, because it seems to me, I was very interested to hear about this change through trade policy, because this is something I must admit I've never heard of. I had assumed that Germany, as a great trading nation, was trading with China for mutual benefit, and the deep China-Germany integration would seem to indicate that that's been a pretty successful track record. I used to live in Liangmachao, in the part of Beijing that has all the German companies, and I've never met a German business person who's talked about this change through trade policy. So I'm very interested to ask, where did this change through trade policy come from? Was this actually at the top of the political system? Was this actually Angela Merkel who talked about this? And if so, do you think it was drinking the American Kool-Aid? I mean, was this really believing that Germany could change the regime in China? Could Germany really bring about democracy, human rights, and freedom of expression? Or was that just a hope? Because it sounded to me like it was an expectation from trade, but I'm not aware of any evidence that trade between countries gives one country power to change another country's regime. Secondly, you mentioned that the German companies have been undermining this policy. So it seems to me then that we have a policy that's in a Kissingerian sort of sense being discussed at the political level, but it's just not being applied at the actual real world level. And so if German companies are undermining this, what's the answer to that? Does that mean that we need the state to enforce some kind of weaponization of trade in the way that the US is now moving? Is that the direction that is being advocated here? And what's the end game? I mean, does that mean that Germany doesn't trade with any country that doesn't live up to its liberal democratic standards, in which case you'd be left trading with about, I don't know, 20, 25 countries in the world? So Germany, as the second biggest trading country in the world, would shrink pretty quickly if that was the case. So I'm a bit astounded at this change to trade policy, but maybe it's my ignorance. But I'm really interested to hear actually how serious was it, or do you think it was just a political slogan in order to appeal to liberal views and you know, pretty respectable aspirations for peace and democracy and human rights anywhere? But was it realistic? That's my question.
Thank you so much for your thought-provoking questions. Actually, I would not consider that question ignorant or anything other. I would actually treat this question as a very serious implication for our trade policy, because that asking that question is actually very legitimate, because that represents a fundamental contradiction. If Germany were to enforce the change to trade policy to the utmost extent, there would be no trade at all, because I think there is no country in the world which has a clean human rights record. Even Germany itself has been well known for some human rights violation, and not only in terms of the history, but also nowadays there are a lot of violations. And in that turn, I think companies undermining that policy is just that trade itself has been the principal trajectory of the German politics. Germany is the largest economy in the European Union. It is the fourth largest economy in the world, and due to that importance, German trade politics is such an essential driver of economic growth, of social stability, of affluence, and in that context, trade output trumps normative approaches. So I'm not certain whether German politicians are well aware of IR theory as the American colleagues are. It could be treated as a realist approach without being realist at all, because I think there is a significant dearth of IR knowledge or IR theory concepts among politicians, which I assume is one of the principal reasons why Germany has been so incoherent. And the change through trade policy actually is very reflective of that phenomenon. The change to trade policy was adopted in the 1970s to facilitate trade with the Warsaw Pact states, specifically the former GDR. And while engaged in trade policies, the GDR should be transformed from within by establishing certain conditions for trade. But in that context, it has failed, or it has at least generated mediocre or lackluster results. And that has left certain gaps, and these were exploited by German companies. And the German lobbies are very strong, and they engage in corrupt practices at a very extreme extent. Once I met a Russian journalist, and he said the Germans are as corrupted as everyone else. It's just more difficult because the German government has implemented so many different regulations, and or disabling the German companies to engage in such practices in a conventional way. They need to find these loopholes. They need to find weaknesses within the system to exploit this. And as the change to trade policy has been just vaguely formulated with much space of interpretation, they were just able to undermine it significantly. And now human rights are put on the agenda, specifically by the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, but I don't see a significant change. So the normative agenda is just there for demonstrating some sort of declarative commitment without effectively complying with it. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much. I have a question and a short supplement of the question to Dimitri Erhoklin, if I pronounce it correctly. So you mentioned when it comes to investment, Chinese investment in East Central European states, you said that US and the European Union sees China as a competitor. So you didn't mention Russia. So is there a reason why you didn't?
Excuse me, since Dimitri is not online, so can anyone?
Okay, no, so I can. I finish the question. So, so he didn't speak about Russia, but the question is whether Russia sees China, which comes very close with the Belt and Road to Russian borders, as a competitor, as a challenger, or whether Chinese investment, whether Russia benefits from Chinese investment economically, and is quite silent, not challenging, not seeing Chinese investment as a challenge. So that would be the question. So my supplement would be, nobody mentioned NATO. So NATO is linked to Asia now. So if you read the last NATO strategic concept, the paragraph 1327, so hybrid, China is seen, China's activities, operation, hybrid and cyber operations are seen by the NATO strategic concept as malicious. And then the strategic concepts links this hybrid cyber activities to Article 5 commitments. So if China's activities are defined as a threat to NATO countries, cyber or hybrid, it can invoke Article 5, which means that all NATO member states have come to the aid if the NATO Council decides that one NATO member is threatened by China's activities. So we have a direct link now between Europe. Of course, NATO is dominated by the US, and the strategic concept mainly was written by President Biden, more or less. So, so we have a link now between the European NATO to China in the field of security. I just wanted to mention this because we should not forget this. It's a new development that extends NATO's traditional territory to Asia now.
And I want to answer, and it is very dangerous that NATO is trying to go to the east. I think there is no need to go to the east. After the Soviet Union, it is very interesting that we still have NATO. We could have peace in the world, but of course, NATO is trying to go to east, and we are having these problems. And of course, our Chinese colleagues also can say, and our Russian colleagues, that NATO's activities in cyberspace, it is some kind of threat for China or Russia or other states. So for this reason, I think that cooperation is better. And this conference is good example of this cooperation. So please, if there is other questions, please.
It's like, no, the question is more like correspond with what you ask. So as for Russia, China is being represented from Russia, so I can think I can deliver something. So I can say that it's not like it's either or situation. So China is neither the the threat or the challenger for Russia, but it's definitely the Russian government and especially the expert community does not see China as the only option right now, because of course you ask that if China is a beneficiary for Russia's economy. So in terms of the investments, in terms of FDI in the Far East, yeah, it certainly is, because China is the largest investor in the Russian Far East. But at the same time, of course, Russia is very not like suspicious, but Russia is very cautious in terms of how China is being developed, especially in terms of the economy, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of the military architecture. So that's why Russia, for example, bans the Chinese investments to the Russia's military sector, which is not totally okay with the Russian government. So that's why, in Russia there is a position that China can become in the foreseeable future a challenger, especially in the Central Asia region, which we covered yet today.
I will add one comment, and sorry, and we are speaking about NATO. I like to continue this topic, and my rhetoric question is going to NATO. What was doing NATO member Turkey during the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, and what were doing NATO technologies in this conflict, where people were being killed in Artsakh, and always speaking about it. It is very world like to speak. NATO is helping Ukraine. It is good. People must help each other. But where were the NATO during the war with Azerbaijan, and where were the NATO during the last escalation in when Azerbaijan invaded Armenian territory? So we need do not use the double standards, and I hope that our friends in NATO, in EU, in Russia, and in China will keep their eye on this issue as well. Please.
It's already. I just wanted to make a short comment about NATO expansion. I'm not going to defend it, and I'm not going to promote it. Just going to give a small interpretation, not even a comprehensive interpretation. I think what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the East European Communist bloc was that NATO expansion was seen as sort of a precursor to EU expansion. So many countries in that region, first of all, wanted to have the involvement of the United States. But secondly, it was easier to implement the NATO standards. And afterwards, when you've got the United States involved and you have your security, in their view, arranged, it's easier to further implement the EU acquis, you know, the entire body of legislation of the EU. So from that perspective, I think this is also important to understand the German perspective on NATO expansion. It's not seen as a threat to others. It's more seen as a way to roll out, you know, Western standards of governance and to improve conditions in those countries. And I think in a number of East European countries, this sort of tandem of NATO and EU expansion has been, in fact, very successful. At some point, I think that both organizations, be it NATO or EU, came into conflict with, you know, other efforts by another, or not even one, but other blocs or other powers. So I think that is something to keep in mind, that maybe it was like the current situation, whatever you think of it. Let's not have that discussion now, but important, I think, to think of it that in a way that the conflict that has arisen now was perhaps not always foreseen. And maybe that's also where, in the end, part of the solution would lie, to sort of take away this sphere of confrontation. Just a not so short remark.
I want to react, and so sorry. I don't want to. Seeing NATO, I don't think that it is EU. Actually, I don't think that it is the same organization. NATO has different aims. EU has another aims. So and I don't want to see in EU NATO. it is totally different things, totally different organizations. And please, Radu.
No, it might seem a little bit off, but I would like to go back to that Russia, China in Central and Eastern Europe. Back in 2012, when China launched this platform, this China CEEC platform, and we know replicas of similar initiatives around the world, there was one interesting aspect, and a lot of people speculated on that. Why Ukraine or Moldova or Belarus, for that matter, have not been invited to take part into this platform. And the argument was that China is trying to respect Russia's sphere of influence. This speculation or myth was debunked in 2019 when Greece joined the platform. And getting to that, it makes me wonder whether, and linked to what Sebastian online said about that with technology, with what Sebastian said about that divide et impera. Are we, we have had 17+1, we're going now to a 14+1. How about we make it 27+1? Because in that way, we're going to amplify, and China will amplify, a Europe with multi-speed Europe, right? The concept of two-speed Europe, which is definitely not what we want to see in Eastern and Central Europe.
I want to go back to the NATO and it's what I said for Chris. I can bring you one country's example. Austria. It is EU member, but it is not NATO member. And maybe Professor Gärtner will explain us. Are you losing from it, or are you getting some opportunities to work with ours? Please, if you want, if no.
Austria wouldn't have remained neutral if it joined NATO. So, but there is no problem with the European Union. So maybe it might, this precursor theory might be valid for other countries, but Austria makes a real distinction between alliances and European integration. So that's, yeah. No.
Any other comments, criticism, or reaction?
We'll do it later. I think we're not so far from, our positions are not so far removed.
Okay. Do we have any other questions in online or offline, in person? If no, I want to thank my good friend, Ms. Wendy, for this excellent moderation, and our colleagues, panel speakers, for their speeches, interesting speeches. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's applaud them.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very, very nice to meet you again. Hope next time is in Yerevan or in Hong Kong.
Sure, my friend.